So in other words, I don't want to argue about the definition of cognition, but I do want to point out that isn't it interesting that we can take tools that we've been using to study brainy behavior for many decades. We can take those tools, and I'm talking about everything from optogenetics, neurotransmitters, perceptual multi-stability, active inference, just across the spectrum of practical and conceptual frameworks that we study in brains. And we can show that those tools allow us to discover new science when you port them elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So my point is simply this: if the tools can't tell the difference, then you're not able to say that, well, that's not real cognition. That's sort of as if cognition. It's real if the tools are helping you find new science. That's how I see it. So by cognition, I mean a very wide spectrum of properties, all the way functional properties, all the way from simple learning, habituation, sensitization, associative conditioning, predictions, being able to make predictions, being able to hold counterfactuals, planning, all of those things. We haven't claimed, for example, language use in any of these things. So I don't, obviously language is part of cognition. We've never seen an example of proper grammar, at least yet, in these things. So I don't say language, but most everything else that I've just mentioned exists far outside the brain.
Mm-hmm. And so it's usually pretty intuitive for people to think about information and cognition when it comes to the brain and the nervous system, because that's the organ most identified with cognition. And then, you learn about action potentials and spiking, and okay, this makes a lot of sense. These cells have a behavior that gives you a code, right? They can spike with a certain pattern, and they have this all or nothing information code that is, it's very intuitive to think about how this can serve as a binary coding scheme that can, produce cognition and behavior and all the stuff that brains do. But there's also examples out there, I think, of analog coding in biological systems. And that's not something you usually hear about as often unless you're sort of deep in this world. What is the difference between analog and digital coding? And what are some examples to get people thinking about analog systems in biology?
Yeah, let me take one step back before we get into that, just to kind of set the stage a little bit. If we ask ourselves, so what I think the neuroscience is not the study of neurons. I think neuroscience is the study of the cognitive glue that binds competent subunits into higher level cognitive agents. So you and I are more than the sum of a bunch of neurons, because there's a set of policies and mechanisms that allow up a very particular kind of networking to form. And so that's electrophysiology that allows our neurons to work together, to have memories, goals, preferences, and to have computations that individual neurons are not doing. That's not to say they're not doing any. They're doing some, but they're not the same as what you and I are doing. And so we can ask then that question. Okay, so that's a remarkable that bioelectricity or electrophysiology as a kind of cognitive glue in that sense. Where did that come from evolutionarily? Like, how old is it? And it turns out that evolution discovered that electrical networks are really good for this kind of thing. So integrating or synthesizing information across space and time, storing memories, doing computations. That was discovered by evolution around the time of bacterial biofilms. It's extremely ancient. So all of the same components that we study in the brain, ion channels, electrical synapses or gap junctions, neurotransmitter machinery, all of that stuff is incredibly ancient. It predates multicellularity, and it's homologous. The kinds of things I'm talking about are evolutionarily homologous with the things that people study in the brain. And so the next question you would ask is, okay, so if these things were around before brain and muscle were here to move us in three-dimensional space, which is why the kind of digital coding is so prevalent, what were these networks thinking about before? And my claim is simply this: that everything we do in the brain is an evolutionary pivot of using these exact same mechanisms to traverse a different space. This is long before nerve and muscle came on the scene. That is the space of anatomical shapes.